Well, we lost the first hour. So thank you, Joe. We won't lose the second hour. So we're just getting into the didactic part. We already had introductions, first reactions, many of which were very good. And I wish we had captured all those, but sorry, forgot to hit the record button until Joe reminded me. Okay, so let's start with why is this the leap? So it's the leap as the transition. We mentioned earlier, I think not everyone was here yet, that in German, this is springen. This is the same root word as beginning, Ursprung. So if we're going from one beginning to another beginning, we're doing the new beginning thing, and the beginning thing is springing. So part of that's just there in the metaphor. There's obviously reference here to the leap in Kierkegaard. He talks about the recklessness of it. He talks about abandoning the attempt to effectively be on solid ground where you can assure the truth of everything you're saying. There was a kind of repudiation of the notion of system in the previous section. We saw that, or not repudiation of the notion. It's like inceptual thinking doesn't do that, because inceptual thinking is about unfolding beginnings, ongoing events, ongoing discovery, etc. So the other thing that the leap refers to here is, if I can put it this way, there's a notion of active participation in it. I think Mel was raising this thing of, how passive is this, and are you just watching these things happen? And it's a fair criticism of Heidegger that his notion of action is very different from the usual notion of action, but he does have a notion of something like authentic engagement to action here. It may be that the action is way more like thought and introspection than action compared to other thinkers. Why did I bring this up? Because at multiple points here where he's describing the leap, he's contrasting the difference between just talking about this or playing with the concepts versus actually enacting or doing it, right? And the actual enacting or doing it here is essential to the leaping. The leaping is something you do. It's not something you see. So that's part of why that metaphor is there, to call it a metaphor for Pete, or as Pete said. So it is meant to be the bringing about of a transition, but it is also participating in the transition, and it is an enacting. And why is it an enacting? It's there's a from the inside about all this. So now that said, there still is a notion that Mel is right, has a passivity to it in this. The term that we use repeatedly throughout this chapter is being appropriated by being, right? Which has that passive tone to it. Being seizes Dasein, being seizes the consciousness, right? This is the flaring up of attention that Joe is talking about, but also in the beings abandoned by being of the previous two sections, really, that sense of things is that seizing not happening, right? So and it's fair to ask in many of these things, what of this does Heidegger think the thinker can contribute on his own and of his own volition? And we'll get to that in the issue of mastery and violence. He talks about between being and the levels of life, levels of being and life stuff, which I said we want to get to. There's definitely a sense in Heidegger that if the human activity is forcing the outcome to go in a particular direction, it is manipulative in that sense, that it is not taking its directive of what should happen from the thing being experienced or understood, that this counts as a mental form of violence. And this is like the technological thinking that he is diagnosing as outcome of modern metaphysics. So the thought as a manipulated tool to achieve ends is something he is running away from here. and this will come out in the mastery violence contrast when we get to that. So the leap has this character of a it's not even that it's trusting, it's a venturing exposure to a danger of abandoning a familiar, something like that. But let's look at what he says about the actual basic disposition of it. This is at the very first section of our reading 115, where he calls it the most daring venture, right? And their utter recklessness, etc. But he says the disposition motivating is precisely the diffidence in which the will to restraint surpasses itself. We'll come back to that because that's the clear formulation. Towards steadfastness in withstanding the most remote nearness of the hesitant withholding. And that's like one of these things where you've got all of these little short formulas, locked together like train cars, and each pair of words makes another puzzle that until you've, unpacked all the puzzles, you can't tell where the sentence is going. But underlying thing, it's a diffidence, it's a will to restraint. We saw that back in the discussion of the resonating. The resonating was this notion that there's something out of joint in the modern world. There's something off, right? And that was described as diffidence. So we're hearkening back to that something like diffidence at the end of metaphysics, diffidence at the nothing happening to being, which is a restraint, a holding back, a non-consenting, if you get me. And he says this surpasses itself towards steadfastness. And this is the language of being in time about resoluteness, surpassing towards steadfastness. What does that mean? It means that it's not just a reluctance, it's reluctance hardening into an active will to not do something. I am not going to be a technological thinker in the modern end of metaphysics Nietzschean mold. I'm not doing it, right? It's the will not do otherwise kind of steadfastness. What is that towards? Withstanding the most remote nearness of the hesitant withholding. So the withstanding, again, is part of that resoluteness business from being in time. The hesitant withholding. The hesitant withholding isn't our hesitant withholding. It's something like the hesitant beholding of being. Or I like to put this in some of the previous sections as being in modern man are not in speaking terms. So being is not speaking to modern man. Nothing is happening to being, and that's a hesitant withholding. There is a mystery / concealment of being in the background of things. There is some hesitant withholding of a possible unveiling or truth appearing to man that has not appeared. That is this notion of a hesitant withholding. It's creating a sort of background of mystery. Okay, so we talked about the steadfastness, the withstanding, the restraint surpassing itself, hardening into resolve. The hesitant withholding is something like the plight of the lack of sense of plight, we called it before, but in our own my own terms, it's the lack of metaphysical revelation going on, if you want to put it that way, the lack of insight into the character of fundamental ontology going on. That's the hesitant withholding, thought of as something which is part of the history of a being in potential communication with man not speaking to us, something like that. I've unpacked all the sentence except for the most remote nearness, and I picked that one to highlight next because I think it's the most directly paradoxical. We don't think of nearness and most remote as being, conjoined. If you think spatially, they're not. But he has a definite thought / meaning in mind with the most remote nearness. And I think I can explain what that is to folks and make it make sense to people, but I want to give people a chance if they want to jump in, especially some of our Heidegger scholars, to tell me what the most remote nearness in this passage means to them, what they hear in it, whether or not it has, pardon me, whether or not it has a clear sense to them, or if it's just to them, poetic language strung together that isn't necessarily trying to refer to anything. I think it is trying to refer to something, but I want to hear other people's opinions on it. Pete?
So I think that's, what we're doing right now on Zoom, remote nearness. We're gathered together even though we're physically remote. And he brings this up in other places with regards to radio, that Hitler gathers the German folk into the nearness of his radio addresses and stuff.
So I agree with you that technology can have this sense, but I don't think that that's what he's referring to in the most remote nearness. It's not most remote then. You're right that this nearness, this sense of the gathering and the nearness means something like brought into the nearness of our attention. But it's not simply of our attention. It's actually more like into the nearness of it is there with us, something like that. But I want to get to the most remote part too.
Right. So when something presences for us as physicists, it's near, it's presencing for us, it's in front of us. And like Joe said, being withdraws at the same time. And so it gets remote as the thing that's presencing is doing its presence, or being is doing the presencing for it. We're aware of the thing before us. We're not aware of what made that possible. So that's my
I mean, I think part of this gets to I think it was Josh's point about the futurity aspect of time, of the things coming toward us. There's this notion that you get in being in time of a toward us and away from us that things have, as like one of the fundamental experiences within world. But so nearness has that sense to it. It's part of the spatiality of Dasein, that it's not just meant. It's not simply physical spaces. The physicists think of it, so something like that, right? But I still think that this most remote has a very definite meaning, right? The most remote means take anything that you could focus your attention on. That's not as remote as this, right? It has to exceed the remoteness of any remote thing. And the way that you exceed the remoteness of any remote things is there's one thing which is more remote than all the things that could be within the scope of your attention, and that is the horizon of your attention, right? That you're in a world that has a horizon is a most remote. The nearness notion is that this is something, because it has this always already character. It's still there if you close your eyes. It's still there if you don't focus on anything. It's still there if an anxiety or anything else, all of the particulars that you could focus on have dropped away. So the nearness is always with us. So I claim that most remote nearness refers to anything which is always with us, that has this background horizontal character. It's not something in our attention. It's not something lit up for us. It's not a being. What it is a felt presence lingering behind, something like that. It designates something like a felt underlying. Josh?
Yeah. So the way that I would connect that remoteness to the thinking of temporality that I am imputing to Heidegger is this idea of that which is it can't be in terms of anything like an extant horizon, something that is
I put it to you.
Yeah,
so I understand where you're going, but I put it to you that horizons are never simply extant, because they're part of the constitution of Dasein. So horizons exist. That's my claim, but keep going.
Well, okay, so when you say exist, you mean exist in terms of existing as exiting, as transcending, or because that's the way that I would want to think of it. Yeah.
I mean that they have the worldly rather than the inner worldly mode of being attached to them that is more like what Dasein has itself than it is like what rocks have. I'm speaking just very basic, being in time and basic problems of phenomenology versions of these words, right? At that level, horizon doesn't have the character of an extant horizon. I agree with you, but an extant horizon to me is, it's not a physical effect seen from a ship, right? Horizon, as it actually is, as a phenomena of world, is part of the structure of world. If that makes sense, Dan.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry, Dan.
So yeah, going back to what you said, so Heidegger always said something like what's the most difficult thing to notice or to see, it's what's very close to us, and it's always this kind of thing that being, that like forgiveness, like the oblivion of being, or this is the last thing we notice, and that's then the reason is because it's so close to us, and we are not able to see that close anymore, and to notice things that, and being is that gives being, makes everything else present and so on and accessible, but this thing that makes them accessible is the last thing we can see. So I think you are going there, and it's what you are trying, and that's probably what Heidegger is talking about. Right.
This most remote nearness is something like a so close to us that it is always with us, part of us, along with us always, something like that. That is, I won't say never, but is rarely the focus of our attention. But that's the nearness part that you're talking about. The fact that it is the most remote of that is, I put it to you, is designating beyond horizon, and in nearness beyond horizon, in terms of just what it designates, not in terms of what's supposedly causing it or any causal structure or anything, just in terms of what the words designate, is something like a felt behind, right? It's the intuition of a sense of presence of something behind everything directly, in view, experience, anything like that. The thing which is being designated that way right here, by the way, is a hesitant withholding. So that remote nearness is not itself an object. It's something. It's a sense or a reference that can be. You can have different things put upon it. Here, it's the thing being put upon it is this hesitant withholding. This something like the mystery that is not speaking to us, something like that. There's a sense of that as a lurking behind, right? Later in the chapter, he'll talk about that this essential strangeness that we feel about being like this is not simply a mode of being's appearance, but is being itself, being with a Y. That strangeness is something he's pointing out there. Sorry, Pete.
Yeah, so I want to try a different analogy. Our eyeglasses, which are the nearest to us, and all the things that present visually for us go through the eyeglasses that have a convex or concave structure that bends the light, brings it into focus. And the eyeglasses, the analogy is they're like being with a Y, where the structure of being, the clearing, how things presence as event, we're not aware of that, but it makes it possible for us to see things.
So I get what you're saying. I mean, a perfectly neo-Kantian reading, if I put it this way, right? But because he's talking about it as the most remote, I don't think he's just talking about our mental eyeglasses that are making the world appear a certain way, which a neo-Kantian would see in all the structures of the understanding, something like that. Yes, there's a lot of readers of Being in Time that kind of read it that way, but here I think that this particular designation of most remote is trying to get at something which is it has this far away notion, not just in the sense of not noticed, but in the sense of beyond where we could put our attention. Sorry, Jason.
Yeah, I'm thinking that being is always in withdrawal, and it's not removed from this strife. I mean, strife is really important here. We're expecting something to appear or come forward, but the strife is really important. And I don't think it's
So I agree with you that strife. I agree with you that strife is a critical word in this stage of Heidegger, but it's also not in this section yet. So
new.
we're just trying to talk about this what this diffident disposition is. The motivating disposition of the leap is this diffidence hardening into steadfastness, and what it's towards. And he often talks about the strife of earth and world, which we'll come to a little bit later. But here he's not yet talking about that strife. I don't disagree with you that it can be implicated in these structures of the behind or something like that, or the attention. But just this remote nearness, I don't think on its own designates strife specifically. Dan?
Yeah, another metaphor for this that's probably it's something is not in us and is not a thing. It's the light that makes possible visible other things. It's that kind of background and horizon or so on.
Yeah. And you know, this is something that Heidegger talks about when he's glossing Plato in the allegory of the cave and all this kind of stuff in the Essence of Truth essays. But in traditional metaphysics, there's a whole light metaphysics about the good as light and truth as light and all this kind of stuff. So I agree with you. That's kind of another analogy, but both the eyeglasses and the light as these enabling and necessary structures that are seen or projected as being there are to me both examples of how traditional metaphysics tends to try to take these concepts that Heidegger is talking about here and turn them into material objects or material systems, and a theory of or picture of how those material objects, material systems might make the machinery behind the world go the way it goes, something like that. And that is part and parcel of this kind of imagination reifying nature of traditional metaphysics that is part of what Heidegger is moving away from here. But what he's moving away from it here in favor of the affect, the way it feels, the way what the actual experience phenomenon tells us from the inside is the actual character of it, without trying to come up with a physical metaphor to explain how it might work to ourselves, right? If that makes sense. And that's why he's calling it this remote nearness. That the most remote nearness, those are meant to be terms that are, even before you're at the point of a physical metaphor or a glasses metaphor or a light metaphor, they are things that are immediately affectively meaningful to Dasein, right? Nearness is what is, over your shoulder, lingering around you, and all around and encompassing, something like that. And most remote is, a beyond anything which even seems distant, and the juxtaposition of those two together, which the juxtaposition of those two together won't make sense in a material imagination context, right? In a material imagination context is precisely where those two things seem paradoxical with one another. Whereas if you hear them the way he's saying them, it's perfectly natural. And he's trying to shake people out of the thinking about this as just a material metaphor. If it's near, it can't be most remote. And if it's most remote, it can't be near, because they're thinking about it as just like imagined spatial plane or something. They're thinking about geometry. They're not thinking about the affect. And the affect is this remote nearness is a with us that we can't grasp, a with us that is out of reach. Jason?
Yeah, I think there's an example he gives many times with sound, the way we experience sound, that it's near us, but it's remote.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying to get away from the visual clues that we typically use as an example.
I agree with you that he's trying to go with visual clues. I think that sound as an alternative metaphor can help in some of these things, but the point is he's trying to go down to the level of the affect, the way it feels, to try to see the meaning in that, especially because he's trying to describe, right, a basic disposition, a resolute diffidence, basic disposition. But what's this crazy hardening resoluteness about? It's a crazy hardening resolution about steadfastness in withstanding. Steadfastness in withstanding what? Right? The fact that this plight of lack of sense of plight, this nothing happening to being, this all the stuff we were talking about in section 2, that hesitant withholding of truth out of our grasp, truth not talking to us, something like that. It is a resoluteness in withstanding that seeming to be present, unavoidable, something like that. It's a lingering over that fact. It's a turning to face that fact. So it's easy to see that as something which is unimportant. It's easy to not dwell on that, right? It's easy to decide not to do metaphysics and go be distracted by whatever the concerns of the day are, right? And this basic disposition is a call to do metaphysics in the broader sense that Mel was talking about. So to pay attention to what? To pay attention to the fact that there is this an underlying sense of a mystery lurking behind things that we cannot quite grasp, but that we're trying to grasp. Something like that. And we're just describing a feeling. This is a paragraph about a basic disposition, and he's just trying to get that feeling right? He wants to evoke that feeling, and he has to use some technical language to do so, to differentiate it from a lot of sort of other images or something. Yes, wonder, right? There's a whole book he has on that topic where he calls wonder the founding experience of philosophy in the original beginning. It's sorry, that's in this book. I think Dan recommended to us a while ago. If you're interested in Heidegger on wonder, read this book. Okay, so a fine comment. I realized, by the way, that Christian came in, and I realized he never got a chance to give us his first reactions because he came in a little bit late. But before we move past the basic position and remote nearness, Christian, do you have first reactions to our reading or things we've just been talking about?
Yeah, sure. I'll just share a couple of quick thoughts, guys. And I hope it's okay if I just join in for just a couple of hours today. I ended up getting bogged down with some work today. So
No problem.
I'm just gonna hang around for as long as I can here. But yeah, I'll go ahead and just skip my first reaction since I'm coming in late, but I will just make a comment on what you guys were just talking about. So I'm not sure exactly which passage you guys were referring to, but I am familiar with this language in Heidegger of the most remote nearness. And Jason, I think you're right. I think it's a little different here than how he meant it in Being and Time, maybe. Although I think there is a kind of a similar structure. And I think, Jason, everything you said about the structure of the horizon as Dasein itself as horizon, and you can make all these sort of connections to temporality and spatiality. Dasein is sort of regional in both time and space, and there is this kind of finite boundary, and Heidegger surely is sort of trying to point to the boundary in a sense. But I think that what's interesting too is that the discussion of death comes back in this chapter, and I think that there is some structural similarity with in Being and Time, the discussion of anticipatory resolution and the anticipation of death. There is a kind of a behind, which, yeah, I think the way that you were describing it, Jason, there's this sort of we're always oriented on some being or other, but there is this kind of other side to that. And in Being and Time, death is associated with the disposition of anxiety. But I think here he's expanding out. He's talking about this diffident shock, which is sort of implicitly calls for a resolution. So there's some similarity of what's going on here. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a good connection. I mean, we'll get to this section on being towards death, which is like the ninth of my 10 things or whatever. Second to last section of our reading, basically. But I do think that that's another thing which has this character of our most remote nearness. It's only most remote for most people who are distracting themselves most of the time. It's not always most remote for Heidegger. But the other connection I'd make here is to the resoluteness business. This becoming resolved. That's the place where this is really coming in. And I don't think it's just in a context of anxiety that being towards death comes up in being in time. It's in the context of this resoluteness business, and the connecting motivation of that is awareness of one's finitude makes one serious about what one is doing as one's own, something like that. Yeah, it's you're whether you like it or not, spending your life, and that's another one of these nearnesses that, from Heidegger's point of view, shouldn't be so remote. Should be more in front of people's mind. And he talks in our reading section about that as being the motivation for the steepest path. The steepest path is a mountain climber's metaphor of, if you want to get up the mountain, you can take the easy way where you go around the contour lines and only gradually rise, or you can turn right where the slope rises and go up, as direct as possible. It's the hardest to do. It will work your legs the most, but it will get you to to gain altitude as fast as possible, right? And the motivation for the steepest path is the finiteness of the time that Dasein has. But so I do think there's a connection there. But on this just the remote nearness point, I think that on its own, it's just referring to this lurking around notion, to this this unfocused upon lurking around notion. And here the particular thing that we're talking about, section 115, the hesitant withholding is what is being said to be lurking like that. It's not death that's lurking like that. It's the hesitant withholding, which is this structure we've been talking about since in 2 and 3 of how being essentially occurs is a question that traditional metaphysics has not managed to raise, let alone answer. And there is some withholding in that. There is something concealed in that. There is something. There is mystery in that. Why wouldn't the whole history of philosophy have turned over this question and addressed this question and answered this question? It didn't. There was something withheld. There was something left unsaid. There was an unthought there, and the sense of that unthought as a withheld about which we should be curious, about which Heidegger is curious, that has a beckoning in it. That's that hesitant withholding that is lurking. So if I put it this way, the experience of the disenchanted world we talked about in 2, right, has this, it motivates a kind of diffidence of something out of joint, and that's now sharpening to the point of the thing which is out of joint is that we're not curiously asking this question, which would advance metaphysics, that would advance our understanding, metaphysics in a broader sense, not Heidegger sense, our philosophical understanding, that would advance philosophy, right? And a resoluteness to focus on that as the unthought that needs to be thought, and now with urgency, something like that, is the basic disposition behind this leap.
Yeah, that's really well said. As you were speaking there, I was just wondering too, if he doesn't, it's almost like he just drops the term care after being in time. But I almost wonder if we could analyze this notion a little bit in terms of care, that there's like always in Heidegger, there seems to be this basic sort of hollowness to care that is sort of structurally necessary. And I mean, even though he doesn't use the terms, he seems to be pointing to it all over the place here.
So I think that's fair, but the care of being in time was something that, yes, it was part of the structure of Dasein. It was also something with which Dasein was beset. It was something unavoidable, and it was there even in the everyday. And the difference is here we're talking about something like intellectual calling to something peak, right? To what the focus and attention should be on, right? Which
The
is
highest
not,
calling of philosophy.
or whoever is a candidate for leaping in this case. But yes, so anyone who is feeling like they might need to leap into another beginning because they're dissatisfied in some way with something out of joint in previous metaphysics, right, is a candidate for both this feeling and for activity of philosophy in this direction.
Yeah.
Right. And if you don't have that feeling, you're not on the field.
Yeah.
Right. That's that underlying motivation is the motivation to look. It's the motivation to search in the first place. And that's the point of explaining, having this be the opening section of the whole thing. And obviously not everyone will have that motivation. Not everyone will have that, that basic disposition, and they will be watching something someone else is doing here. They will not be doing it themselves, but which is
And
fine.
it certainly relates back too to in the last section, the whole theme about the absconding of the gods and man being abandoned by being. I mean, this is, I think, very much, he's sort of starting from the same place here.
And that's what the very next section is about, right? So we get the fair segue. I mean, I think we've covered the first paragraph. Only took us an hour and a half. But the next section is about this history of being, and there's some preliminary hemming and hawing about. I'm not talking about just some sort of abstract periodization in history of click the stopwatch. When metaphysics ended, other beginning starts. Right? None of that. The two are going to interpenetrate with one another. They are terrains in which these questions are alive for people. Something like that. He lays out that understanding. And says that the old history will drag on, and we'll talk about some of the choice words he has for all that. But he's trying to explain what this leap is onto. This leap is onto the terrain of another history, and this is the history of the kinds of happenings that are happening in the history of being with a Y. Okay, and what are these happenings? We need to just look at the bottom of page 179 for a second. Calls them rare events. What kind of rare events? The assignment of truth to being, the collapse of truth, the entrenchment or the distorted essence of truth, correctness, abandonment of beings by being, the entry of being into its truth, the kindling of the hearth fire of the truth of being, we'll come back to that, as the solitary sight of the passing by of the last God, and the flaring up of the non-repeatable uniqueness of being, right? So those are the kinds of events that history of being is about. Right. So don't worry about how times, what the time scales of those are, or what the, what the events of them are. Those are things which are his story of the history of metaphysics told like a first half of them, and his attempt to inaugurate another beginning is meant to be about the other half of them. But all of them are something like if I can put it this way, a philosophical sacred history, right? These are the stories of the stages of the discovery of the truth of being, right? And the events that matter in it are those stages occurring. Now, the events that matter in it could be, when he says the assignment of truth to being, he's thinking there of being becoming the word that the Greeks used to think about truth. He's thinking of the Anaxagoras and the Heraclituses and the Parmenideses there, right? But he's thinking of that as a event. At one time in Greece, being became the word that Greek thought lit up about to talk about truth and to talk about physis, right? And arising, appearing, and basic ontology, and that inaugurates something, right? But that is the beginning of the first beginning, but that is glossed here as just the assignment of truth to being, right? As a single event, right? But I want to explain here that when he calls that an event of this kind, events of this kind, what the history of being is made up of, he's not saying anything that happens. This is not so universal a thing that every occurrence of a sparrow falling, right, is the event, right? He's talking about very specific things in a philosophical history, and that philosophical history is about the drama of truth about being revealed to man, right? Okay, and we can talk about the later stages of that, which are things which are promissory notes at this point. There are sketches of how he imagines it going in the other beginning, if you get me. The kindling of the hearth fire, the truth of being. Some of that is this sight business of Dasein, but calling it the hearth fire, I don't know how much people know about that image in the history of Western mythos, pre-philosophical metaphysical thinking and religion, etc. But hearth fires were the thing which that represented the soul of the family staying alive through the generations. It was the spirit of the family passed on, right? The family was not as mortal as its individual members. The family was a thing longer in time, perhaps immortal in time, but certainly longer in time. And the symbol of that flame that passed from one carrier to another was the hearth fire, right? So the fire there is a metaphor of life and spirit, right? So and here the life and spirit is illumination about being, right? So think of be a Hegelian for a second and think about the history or career of absolute spirit, right? As becoming self-conscious, something like that. It's a similar kind of story here about an unfolding history that is a history of it's not simply consciousness because it's both sides of it are moving, but that is an awakening, a lighting up, a coming to consciousness. So if you want other examples of what a history like this looks like, Hegel is a prime example of what a history like this looks like. Okay. So when we're talking about what we're leaping into that sort of history. But when Heidegger says we're leaping into that sort of history, he doesn't mean that we are going to be historiographers who are going to record how it happened in the past without participating. He means we're going to take part in that history. We're going to be actors in that drama, right? We're stepping onto the stage in which the history of being unfolds as participants in it, as called to be places or sites in which truth of being is revealed, etc. Okay. So when we're talking about the leap, we have to ask, what the heck are we leaping into? The answer is we're leaping into that history as an ongoing activity, a philosophical activity, in which mankind is thought of as engaged, and into which we are invited to participate. Okay, called to participate even, and the later stages of it will describe that. How does Dasein? We'll get to Dasein in the next section, but how does Dasein participate in that history? The answer is, it is seized by being with a Y. Right? There's this. Mel was pointing out this sense of passivity and waiting for in these things, and that's definitely there. There's an element of seized by being, but there is this notion of as something that one participates in or not. Okay. And what is this? He calls this being. The essence of being gathers itself into its highest calling as appropriating eventuation, right? So appropriating eventuation, what does that mean? What is the appropriating part? That you have to understand this thing from back in the basic explanation of Dasein in Being and Time, right? For the most part, the content of the Dasein's consciousness is the beings coming at it, right? The being / meaning of things of which the consciousness is aware and to which it is paying attention are its content, are its life, right? So that is, in Heidegger's understanding, that is something which is not simply an inside going outside. It's this between business that happens at an interface, that happens as a between. It's always a communication, and that communication, communion, whatever, has the character of being grabbing us, right? Okay, so that's what he means by appropriating, and then appropriating eventuation as this is an ongoing happening. This is, something like, it is a historical happening that occurs. It is an actuality. It's not a possibility. It's not a concept. It's not a definition somewhere, right? It's an event happening of being appropriating mind, being revealing itself to man, a philosopher thinking about being and having philosophical insights, right? And what do all those do? They assigned the ground and the temporal spatial playing field. And then he says, i.e. Dasein, so that's a definition of Dasein. In the singularity of its history. Why singularity of its history? He's not talking about, doesn't want to talk about Dasein as a philosophical contribution to philosophical anthropology. So you can know some curious fact to put in an encyclopedia about, 7 billion interesting humanoids, right? Singularity of its history. This whole history happens once, right? And even the discovery of this structure as Dasein is an event with the history. It's a happening in this, right? So-and-so discovered the laws of optics, so-and-so discovered Dasein. It's an event in this history. Okay, and that's an assignment to the realm of decision regarding the divinity of the gods. So what is future mankind wrestling with the meaning of being going to do? It is going to wrestle with the divinity of the gods. And wrestle with means, there's other formulations along the way, but it means it's at stake. It means it's in play. It means it's not settled. It means it's not ineluctable, right? And in being in time, we got the notion that Dasein is a being for whom its own being is always at stake. And here we have stakes which are not only the stakes of the Dasein itself, but are stakes of the unveiling of the truth of being. The truth is at stake, right? So that's the drama he's painting here. And he's saying that the leap is to leap into that drama, if that makes sense. Questions or thoughts about any of that on 179, 180? Jason.
Yeah, I'm wondering what's the difference between appropriation and unconcealment? Is that a distinction he makes here, or is this for another time?
It's a fair question. I mean, appropriation is the notion of there being something about there's something about the activity or the origination coming from the side of being in the mind's attention being grabbed by things, and that's what this notion of appropriation is pointing towards. Unconcealment is pointing towards the fact that there is a some originally veiled that comes to be discovered as something like the essential character of truth, right? So there's an essential character of truth as this becoming unveiled of what was previously veiled, of unconcealment. So the second is telling you something about how truth occurs or happens, what truth is like. The former is telling you something like what the call is like, if that makes sense. I don't know if it did.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Fair question. Okay. The very next section is all, even the several is just sort of recapitulations of the history of metaphysics stuff that we've seen before. And I do want to come back to that, because there are things in that recapitulation which I think are, well, there's things in that recapitulation we should pay some attention to, but it's not the most characteristic thing here of the hard terms, right? The overall leap is probably easier for us than things like the turning the fissure and being with a Y. And there's various places along here where he'll give us, if not definitions, he says, let's venture a direct utterance about what being means, something like that, which is not quite saying this is a definition. But I want to get through those term things. So turning, fissure, beyng. The first question is, for folks here, how clear is the notion of what Heidegger means by the turning in this whole context to everybody here? What about the fissure? And then for being as a why, I won't even ask. We'll just go to the things he actually has to say about it positively here. But the turning, what the heck is the turning? You want to take a stab at the turning?
So this is going to be ultimately Heidegger's meaning, but maybe it's a step on the way to thinking along his path. Yeah, so the turning is a turning in Arigness, where sometimes he distinguishes between Arigness and entidness. And it's part of the when there something presences, being withdraws, and it's not a single event. Well, now the thing is here and being's gone away. It's all being is always there. And so this is all it's always going on, and this is what the turn is. And somewhere else he calls it round dance of Arigness. And so that's what I think he means, is the turning is being withdrawing while things are presencing, and it's continuous, as long as, let's say, even if something isn't in front of you, if you're holding it in mind, it's
so
that, yeah.
I understand what you're saying, that the to me the key issue in the turning notion that you're not yet running out is the Dasein and event relationship, right? It's that, is Dasein something that happens inside the event? Is the event something that happens inside of Dasein? Is Dasein grounded in the event? Is the event grounded in Dasein? And the answer to the question is spin. The answer to the question is yes. The answer to the question is, two sides of a coin, something like the each of them is grounded on the other, and one isn't more fundamental than the other. They are spinningly, alternatingly deeper than each other, so to speak, in the sense that each is grounded in the other. But what is actual is the pair, Dasein and event.
Right, and maybe instead of containment metaphor of which one's in which,
Or stands on which.
Yeah. The event happens to Dasein.
But it is also true that this and he's talking about this, we'll get to the notion of being as the trembling of divination, that being needs Dasein.
Yeah.
And the being needs Dasein pole of this is why this isn't simply that the event happens to Dasein. It's that being needs Dasein to appear. There is and I think this is very much about this fundamental underlying between notion of trying to get completely beyond, subject and object and internal and external and all this stuff. He does not want people to think that Dasein is a consciousness underneath which there's an ongoing event which causes it. That is exactly what this notion of the turning is meant to explode, right? Is any model like that, right? He wants to stitch the codependence of these things upon each other into each other so finely and so closely as a single loop that you cannot break them apart again, and that you cannot put one of them underneath and the other on top as some tower of metaphysical causation or structure in the old metaphysical way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So the none of them is independent, can exist independently of the other. Being, well, any form of being, whether it's beings, being as the ontological difference, or being as a Y with a Y, and Dasein, and the event, they're all connected. You can't have one without the others.
So the reason I'm stressing this is because I don't think we can understand what he means by the fissure without understanding what he means by the turning. Because at bottom, the fissure is the distinction. And at bottom, the turning is that these things that are being distinguished may be distinguished, but they can't actually be separated. Not really, not actually. They can only be conceptually separated, right? In fundamental ontology, no being without Dasein. And where Dasein being, where being Dasein. And that inseparability is the turning. But the fissure is being is not Dasein, and Dasein is not being. There is a split, there is a rift, there is a distinction between we are a being that happens to understand being, that being with a Y needs in order to appear, right? And that is a calling or mission, something like that. That is an intellectual destiny in the career of the universe being conscious, something like that. But it's that kind of a needing. It's not the kind of a needing of A caused B in a billiard ball succession, right? So the need that being has for Dasein is for the truth of being to appear. And what threatens or beckons without that is the oblivion of being, right? Dasein is supported by being. Dasein is a form of being. It's the there form of being, right? And the there form of being needs being, is grounded on being in much the old traditional way. Okay, so the fissure, and this fissure is part of the finitude of Dasein. It's part of the fact that divinization is not about divinization of Dasein, who is not divine. He'll say at one point that being is the trembling of divinization. Why? What's to tremble? What is divinization? What's this divinization business? And the answer is this fissure business. Man is not God. Man did not make himself. Man is thrown. Man is in a world not of his own making. And in that whole career, right, man cannot be confused with the necessary being that is the author of its being in all the old versions of metaphysical, self-causation towers. That's not the ground, right? So this fissure business is the notion that there is a distinction here. There's a splitting apart of being into the being with a Y that is hiding, the being of the beings which appear, to the Dasein, which is the there or site in which the appearing is occurring. And that splitting apart of something imagined as unified into that structure with those distinctions is what the fissure means. And that fissure is imagined as happening against a background, or a possible background of a nothing. So this, I put it to you, is Heidegger's replacement for the Greek experience of physis as emerging presence. He wants to get all the pieces of it right. The physis idea only watched nature blossom and didn't notice that the mind watching the nature blossoming was part of the blossoming and the story and the temporality of the blossoming and all of that. It only saw the in front of us part of it. It only saw the watching part of it. It didn't see our participation in it, and it didn't see the distinction. And Heidegger wants to capture that distinction. He wants to get the metaphysics of that kind of relationship of how emerging presence happens right. And that's what this fissure business is about. It's trying to get that, how this emerging presence is an involvement of a ground and a needed site for the appearing to happen and the meanings of the particular beings that appear within it, trying to get that nest of relations right, which to any other philosophy but Heidegger's we just call basic metaphysics, right? That's what he's trying to do here. But the structure he's setting up there is to have this turning notion to explode the idea that you just have Dasein as a structure dependent upon an underlying being. No, because each is founded on the other in terms of what being actually means, being with a Y that has history and so on. And from the standpoint of Platonism, that's an immense subjectifying of being, right? But he doesn't view it as a subjectifying because he's trying to get past that subject object to the between where they're united. But he's also trying to get the way in which these things split apart. There's a natural splitting apart of structuring of this into these, you put it this way, the categories of ontology. The categories of ontology are not things like object and subject. They are things like being, Dasein, divinities, something like that, or divinity, as something which Dasein does not have, by the way.
So Jason, I always want to read this appropriating term as somehow being and Dasein each need each other to sort of come most properly into their own, to sort of most properly count as Dasein and as being. And that there is a sense in which Dasein can sort of be, but it can be as not properly Dasein and having been abandoned by being, so that it's not Dasein and being have not come into their own, and that you need both of them for each of them to be most fully what they are.
So I think that's right. I think that's
Okay.
right. I would add though that it's specifically the truth of being, the appearing of being, that needs Dasein that way, right?
Yeah.
The accent is on truth there,
Yeah.
right? And as for fallen Dasein is still Dasein, absolutely, right? And still has all of these characters of existence. Inauthentic existence is existence, right? So what happens when human beings don't pay attention to these callings? What happens is nothing is happening to being. Oblivion of being beckons. What's the how does he put it at 180, right? While the destruction of the outgoing world as self-destruction streams out its triumphs into the void, right? As a gloss, right? Just intro clause, right? Mankind is, beating his chest and screaming his accomplishments to the empty heavens. Who cares? There's nobody there, right? You determined that there was nobody there, and what are you boasting about? To whom, right? And that's just the destruction of the outgoing world and self-destruction. It's self-destruction because it's renouncing of the calling to be the herald of truth, something like that, right? So the destruction of truthfulness can talk about all of its triumphs, but it's by its own admission, it is a meaningless endeavor, right? It deliberately took the meaning out of it. So anyway, I'm trying to give you the gloss about what happens when Dasein does not fulfill its calling.
Yeah.
Right. That's what the stakes are, and there are stakes of that for truth, which are the thing which engages Heidegger the most here, and which he's insisting is characteristic of the other beginning, is that in those things it cares about being and it cares about truth, rather than the old way would care about what does that mean technologically for how things are going to go with mankind, right? In other words, being for the sake of beings. And that was early on in the leap section. This is on 181. In the other beginning, all beings are sacrificed up to being, and only from there do beings as such receive their truth, right? Whereas previously, the only reason to care about any of this truth business was for, you know, what you could do with it, basically.
Yeah.
But that's the contrast being drawn there. Being in service to beings, even if as cause being was seen to be the master. Anyway, we can come back to what that read on history and also about the mastery and violence stuff in a later section. But I'm trying to make sure that, you know, besides this, you know, what's at stake business, we just understand that the direct traditional metaphysics like content to these terms, turning and fissure, and what they are. I want to say replacements for, but the explanatory work they do and what they replace in traditional metaphysical structure is notions like hierarchy of being replaced by turning, and notions like physis as emerging presence replaced by fissure. Right, the concepts that he is trying to correct by moving the old version out of the way and put his new version in not quite the same place are that basic. Right.
Yeah, I was never quite sure how to understand the turning, but if you think it's sort of this reciprocal appropriating, whatever that might mean in this context, that's
yeah,
really
I mean,
helpful.
there's I mean, he talks about very directly here about you know, is Dasein founded on the event? Is the event founded in Dasein? And you know, he calls this the turning of their each is true, right? But the that part is pretty clear to me. If I wanted to reach back to a thing in the tradition of German idealism that this is probably closest to, it's where Hegel is trying to explain why the logic has to reason in a circle, right? You have to have you know, a starting point, and there's going to be a circle somewhere. This is the circle in Heidegger, right? The circle in Heidegger is Dasein and event are linked to one another. Dan?
So do you understand this kind of turning is kind of happening in the history of metaphysics, also something that happens to Heidegger, like from being in time to here?
I'm not thinking of it primarily as an ongoing event, or as a single event, or as, you know, Heidegger's turn kind of thing, right? No, I'm not thinking of it as, you know, I changed my mind about something. That's not what I think the turning is referring to. I think the turning here is referring to this what grounds what oscillation, as he keeps calling it oscillation, at the core of these metaphysical concepts of this, you know, this sight business. And if he were a Platonist, this would be his explanation of the metaxy, of the between, right? Between mind and the ideas, something like that. That's my point, is that there are parallels like this in previous metaphysics, whether in Hegel or in Plato, and you can see the role that it performs here. But the underlying thing he is trying to push people away from is deciding that one of these things is in a traditional tower of being the ground of the other, simply. And you know, you can ask why. I mean, remember the thing in the later the tree on the meadow in the essence of truth, not the essence of truth, in the what is called thinking, right? He's going to insist that the tree stands on the meadow and that we come to the encounter, right? The tree is not in our heads, right? This is the level of the things that he's talking about here. He doesn't want people to have a model in which the tree is in our heads. That's why he talks here about the strife of earth and world. Why? Why is there a strife of earth and world? Because world protrudes out of the earth, meaning Dasein that is conscious arises and appears in a background of a previously there, from which it is a protrusion. When he's talking about how these, which of these things, he says that reciprocal grounding is bearing protruding. That's the bearing protruding is the relationship between earth and world, and instituting projecting. This is the relationship of, fundamental projection in and understanding by Dasein. So, and the earth world relationship and the instituting projecting of projection and understanding relationship are both grounding here. So when people ask, is Heidegger fundamentally an idealist, or is he fundamentally a subjectivist thinker? You can point to passages like this as the places where he's saying, I don't want to be understood that way, right? But I also don't want to be understood simply as a what Kant would call a dogmatic metaphysician who leaves mind out of the tower or stack that explains the world, right? Okay, so anyway, I think that getting to what's meant by being with a Y and why it has a history becomes more comprehensible if you've got those basic pictures of this turning business saying, I'm not saying A is the cause of B or B is the cause of A. I'm saying they both have this, tight relationship with one another and come together. And the fissure is this out of the background nothing, the falling apart of original unity into these distinctions: being, Dasein, appearing, earth, world. In the later Heidegger, earth and sky, men and mortals. Gods and mortals, right? Language. All those basic constituents of the being drama, if you want to put it that way, as distinguished from one another. The fissure is about the opening of that distinction, if that makes sense. Okay. So, I mean, from my point of view, this is all very much traditional metaphysics. I don't mean in his term of metaphysics. I mean, it's the kind of thing that a Plato would do or a Hegel would do. That Hegel would do in the Logic, or Plato would, do in the appropriate section of the Republic, right? It's trying to lay out the basic categories that are going to be used to explain the world. Now, you can ask, how contingent does he think those are? How much does he think those things change? How much is this just his own essay on this? And he's going to, this is self-consciously an attempt, right? This is a new beginning, and this is an attempt. He's not saying this is like a definitive structure. He knows that this is a ventured attempt at explanation of how things seem or appear. Okay. So this on 188, he talks about the stone projection part of the leap, and when I talked about he's putting all this inside of, I know this is an attempt. This is an example of that, right? The leap is the carrying out of projection of the truth of being, in the sense of entering in the open realm, such that the projector of the projection experience himself is thrown, i.e., as appropriated by being. So he's trying to explain this projection he's engaged in of this attempted understanding as something in which he is involved, he is participating in, but he is participating in it as a thrown projector, right? And those are the terms that he's using to explain this, if you can put it this way, this knottedness and this where is the activityness, right? This is not simply his activity. This is something that is an attempt to explain something that appears to be something being is revealed to him. Something like that. Projection speaks thoughtfully of the event. It's revealed that he himself, the more he projects, the more he is thrown as one who is already thrown. So all of that is saying that he is always going to be doing this, as himself with what he knows and now, right? It's a situated attempt, right? So he's not, that is meant to differentiate something like this from a, laying down a model that are the rules for all time of how all these metaphysical relations must work. But that's why, after immediately talking about that, he follows it up with, let us venture the immediate utterance, and this is where we're going to get to what this being means. So the thing which he does in this chapter that he hadn't done before, he's sketched out why there can be, you know, this other question, but now he's going to try to tell you what this being with a Y actually is and means. And remember that the being with a Y is meant to be the answer to the question of how does being essentially occur? It's about this occurring, actual, ongoing activity nature of the thing. And what is the immediate utterance? Being is the trembling of divinization. Trembling of the resonance that announces the decision of the gods about their God. So trembling of divinization. His claim is that why would that be a definition of being here? Well, we saw that back in that truth of being discussion, the history of being discussion, I mean, that there were events of a certain kind that were laid out kind of like a sacred history of the discovery of the truth of being, something like that, right? So trembling of divinization is meant to be, encapsulated in a formula, what can transpire in a history that has such events in it, right? So I have no idea if that goes over people's heads or if that's not clear to people. Does anyone have a reaction to this trembling of divinization explanation of being? Was it incomprehensible to you, or do you have any idea what he's saying there? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I've been wrestling with it a lot. It's definitely not, I wouldn't say it's clear to me, but I keep thinking, every time Heidegger keeps bringing up divinization and the gods, I keep thinking about the way he talks about the God being present in the temple in the origin of the work of art, and that this sort of like holding sway of the world, and that there's the way that Heidegger's using the term God and gods here is very closely related to what he means by being. And I'm, this passage where he says, this trembling expands the temporal spatial playing field in which the trembling itself comes into the open as refusal. And just a few paragraphs earlier, when he's talking about projecting the open realm, I mean, this whole thing, it's like he's trying to get behind how does the open up? And that's my only anchor, is that he's trying to describe that somehow, and he's using this admittedly sort of circular throne situated language to describe it. But I keep trying to piece it together with the connection between divinization and the talk of gods. But it's,
so the gods are behind the world, they're not in it. They don't appear. They linger like the remote nearness. The remote nearness is the way something is felt in the temple. This is there in Hölderlin too, in the way he will talk about these things or think about these things, right? So this sense of a mystery behind, of a concealed mystery behind, is part and parcel of this sense of the divine. Right?
Oh, good. Yeah.
Right. It's not an object. He's not talking about baseballs that are orange, right? And therefore they're more godly than baseballs that are green, right? It's not attributes on an object, right? The sense of divinization is this sense of true ground, only suspected, mysterious, concealed, lingering behind, meaningful. I wish it would talk to us, but it doesn't, right? So from this point of view, you have to imagine that Heidegger is giving you a psychology and anthropology of philosophical revelation, explaining how truth speaks to philosophers. And the answer is sometimes illumination comes to philosophers when the truth speaks to them, and sometimes it withholds itself and they don't hear. Right? That is what he's talking about. And trembling of divinization is something like truth is trying to tell us something, but I can't quite hear it. At the beginning of Parmenides' poem, what's the beginning? And the entire focus of his book on the Parmenides is, stressing that beginning. The answer is, that he is drawn, by a chariot, up to the, gates of the temple where the goddess of truth will speak with him. Because to discourse about being and tell the truths about, about the possible three paths is a philosophical revelatory thing to Parmenides. The appropriate language for it is this language of divine revelation of philosophical truth, right? And but here it's not always revelation. The whole point is there's this hesitant withholding, right? We're not receiving, right? We're not in tune to be receiving, right? So we can feel the trembling of we could be receiving, but we're not receiving because we're not in tune.
Good.
Right.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful.
Joe?
Yeah, just a sort of a throwback question in my understanding. Should I regard the gods as extant or existing?
You should regard them as non-existent.
What?
You should regard them as non-existent.
So they would be extant, not even
No,
extant?
no. They're not. It's not that they're not, certainly not extant. If they were, they would exist. But apparently they're not here at the moment. They have absconded.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was trying to sort out.
But this is the point, right? This is why he calls it the place for decision about the gods, or he talks about the presence or absconding of the gods, right? This sense of the mystery behind things that is pregnant with truth or possible revelation that does not occur, that is the actual sense for these things. And that means that the actual experience of them for us here and now is, of the two, exists or extant, exist, but with a not sign in front of them at the moment, right?
Yeah, you know,
And in the future, there will be a decision. There will be a strife about a decision about the presence or absconding of the gods. It is part of our possible future that gods could appear or remain absent, right? And that is part of the mystery and uncanniness of the history into which we are thrown. We do not know which way that goes. That's the mystery aspect, right? And the calling aspect is to investigate that. The calling aspect is to wonder at that, not to decide it, especially not to decide it for any, technological current human purpose, right? It's going to be felt and heard in the future by such people as are attuned to it. But who knows what they will hear? We're not them. They're not here yet. Currently, the gods have absconded.
Presumably, Heidegger thinks that this would have been a pretty alien disposition for the Greeks to have experienced, right? Because I mean, I think about, I keep coming back to this passage of the god is present in the temple in the origin of the work of art. And to me, that means when the god is present in the temple, the Greek world is alive and it's working, and things are their being is being bestowed upon them.
Hearty entire agreement, but remember that in the Hellenic age, the cry went up by the great Greek poets, the great Pan is dead.
Ah,
They had their own experience of the gods absconding as well,
interesting. Okay.
right? So,
well, and in Parmenides, there wouldn't have been this two paths of going with the,
there's
if
three,
not.
but
Yeah.
there's three paths, but
That's right. Yeah.
Parmenides and even Heraclitus before him are self-consciously replacing a philosophical, truth-directed way of thinking about these things for the mythological and the magical, right? They want these things to be questions for philosophy, and to be questions that are decided by truth, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they want to change the questions to rule these questions out of court.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where the modern disposition is much more like the oblivion happening to being side of things, right? Because they want the questions to just go away, never think about that again, right? And that's what Heidegger is expressing the diffidence about. There's something out of joint in the modern world that people do not even have this curiousness about why the question of the meaning of being was never asked. So for 2,000 years, the official worldview of the leading thinkers of the Western world was that God and the highest being were the same thing, and the philosophy of Aristotle and the philosophy of Avicenna, the deity that they thought was one with the deity of the philosophers was known by the moniker beyng, and it never occurred to anyone to ask, how does being essentially occur in a phenomenal way? Is that question worthy? Is that strange? Right. So that's the kind of question or even motivation he's engaging here. When he says that the basic attitude of the modern world is something of diffidence, it's about that. That's what he's diffident about. There's something being missed that people don't ask those questions. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, this is bringing me to mind Nietzsche, and he says something like, he identifies God with horizon, and he said we wiped our horizon, and it's kind of like that kind of to understand God maybe in terms of horizon. And here we kind of talk about horizon a lot in Heidegger.
Right. So Nietzsche does say, in the Madman essay, you're talking about the Madman aphorism, what were we doing when we wiped away the entire horizon, right? But the point of that is that it was the orienting highest, and Nietzsche thinks about these things primarily in value terms. He thinks of religion as being Platonism for the people, but the hierarchy of being is fundamentally at bottom to Nietzsche a hierarchy of value, and at the top of that hierarchy of value is something like an abstract good in the Platonic scheme or something like that. And when he thinks of what is being overturned or done away with when metaphysics crashes or nihilism beckons, is that, right? That is, you can talk about that in terms of the superstructure, to speak Marx for a second, of the external religion, or you can talk about that in terms of the substructure, the actual causing thing of the metaphysical philosophical view behind it, right? But that's just surface and depth, right? The surface is the external religion, and the depth is the Platonic philosophy upon it which it was based, right? But the contention of the Nietzsches of the world is that it's not the superficial trim that's crashing. It's the underlying philosophy that's crashing, right? That's why it counts as nihilism and not just as we need a slight updating of our inventory of objects that exist in the world, but it won't really change our value hierarchy at all, because we'll just have a human good there at the top instead of a divine good there at the top. Right, and so that won't make any other difference. But I'm just putting this back into tying it back to the Nietzsche stuff you bring up. I mean, horizon was not as fundamental a term for Nietzsche as it is for Heidegger, I would say. But this peak of the hierarchy in value terms is, I think, the way that Nietzsche has thought of it. Okay. So. The trembling of divinization. There's other things he says about being, to tie this back into being in time. I want to just give it if you're reading sections like this and you see being with a Y and you don't quite understand what he's getting at, just perform the following thought experiment, which I'll qualify in just a second, right? Read the same passage and substitute the word time for the word being with a Y. And imagine you're reading the later parts of being in time or basic problems of phenomenology. You're still going to have to go back and read it again after that, because you will notice it's still off in some ways, because his being with a Y here is not the concept time, even the concept fundamental time. But time is something which fundamentally occurs. Time is the ongoing event in which man is instantiated. time is the category of actuality and the experienceable, and it's closer, at least, than than being as something which immediately conjures external extant object, which is not at all what being with a Y is, right? So if it helps you read the passage 3 times, the first time through, then the second time through with the time replacement substitution, and then again with the being with the Y relation resubstituted, so you can see the differences between the being with the Y and the time that you tried substituting. Okay. Okay. So we see this also in 190, page 191, section 125. Time should become experienceable as the ecstatic playing field of the truth of being. So there's going to be other things about time and time space in the latter parts of the book, but here he's speaking very much about how time was being discussed in Being and Time specifically. What's the underlying point here? The underlying point here is that being as the ongoing happening in which Dasein lives and occurs, something like that, is nothing like the elapsed time, the old Aristotelian notion of time, but it is quite close to the existential time of basic problems or being in time. Okay. Refusal. What's this refusal business? I mean, I think we've talked about it enough. Well, not to have talked about it enough. We talked about it many times before, but the point is to now put refusal in the context of this being, right? Here's the point. If you're listening for the voice of being with a Y, you hear even the silence. That's what he means by the refusal, right? So even if you're not attuned enough to be getting any signals, even if you're not noticing truths about it, if you're listening for it, what you're hearing is the ringing of a missing, so to speak. The music shut off, a little while ago, and your ears are still ringing for the missing sound that you're not hearing, but you're not hearing it. That's what he's talking about here, is the refusal, right? So in the divinization terms, it's the non-revelation, but non-revelation as something experienced positively. Okay. I want to talk about mastery. So there's a absolutely critical section on, where is it? Right. It's actually in 159, where the title of the thing is about the fissure, but he's talking about mastery, power, and violence. He's giving you definitions of mastery, power, and violence. Did you guys read this section? Did this section make an impression on anyone? Okay. Mastery essentially occurs as bequest. Beings are transformed out of being. It is the necessity of what is free towards what is free. It essentially occurs as the unconditionality in the domain of freedom. It needs no power and thus no violence, but is all the more effective. What is he talking about here? If you have the experience of a truth and a proper coming from the thing itself, what occurs is mastery. You're completely free to do whatever the subject demands, but you must do what the subject demands. That must has the character of a loyalty to what is revealed to you as true, appropriate, good, right? So it is a necessity of something free. And it is a necessity of something free as a revealed proper. Okay. He's going to immediately contrast that with violence, with power and violence. Power is the securing possession of violent possibilities, so it's always related to securing. And what does violence mean? Incursion into beings with a capacity for change without a leap ahead and without a view to possibilities. Whenever beings are changed by beings, not out of being, violence is necessary. Every act is one of violence, and such that here the violence is mastered by means of power. So what's the point here? The point is that where what is done is not coming from what is announced by being as the needful and proper for the thing. You are instead listening to beings, yourself, other people, causal chains manipulating the world, whatever. And the directives determining what use is made of that freedom are, on the one hand, willful, and on the other hand, subordinate to beings and to lesser things. And those acts are always violent rather than masterful. Why violent? Because moving against the nature of the act in that case. Okay. So far, I'm just sketching what he's saying. And I want to assess it a little bit for you. This is a notion of something like appropriate and proper in action that is functionally equivalent to what Platonists talk about as the true, the good, and the beautiful. The way in which the good or the beautiful directs action is not by pushing from behind as an impelling force, but as beckoning from in front by a proper, an apt, a desirable, right? So what he's calling the mastery here of direction by being is akin to the direction by good in Platonism. Direction by good in Platonism declares a necessity for the free act, and that necessity is to conform with what the case, what the subject, what the thing needs, what its being demands, right? And acts that are not pursued that way and for that reason are deviations from aiming at the good in Platonic terms, right? And that is how you get unjust, violent, against nature. Those are all the other terms that a Platonist would use for these things. So Heidegger is sketching a similar philosophy of action, which is part of a philosophy of something like spiritual legitimation of things. If the motivation for something is what the thing demands as for the service of the truth of being, as the truth of being is revealed to you, then you are acting with mastery, and that is a form of effectiveness that is not violence and legitimates itself. Okay, I want to just put on another Platonic hat for just a second to translate these into terms that are maybe more intuitive for people. You're talking about the contrast in the Republic between are the rulers doing what they're doing for the sake of themselves, for the sake of the ruled. To rule for the sake of the good of the ruled is to serve them. In that sense, to rule is to serve, not to master. But it's mastery because it's whatever is needed by the case. The physician who seeks the health of the person they are advising rather than their own good is acting according to the needs of the case. They exercise mastery. They then get a legitimacy conferred on their advice and wisdom that is freely earned, doesn't require any power, doesn't require any structures of violence, doesn't require any repression, etc. Right? It just is. It's just people are following because it is proper and they can see that it is proper. That's what correct spiritual authority looks like. From the Platonic point of view, it is legitimated by wisdom, right? From a Heidegger's point of view here, it is legitimated by mastery, what he's calling mastery, which is a listening to being, right? And in the Platonic world, the ruler who tries to rule for the sake of the rulers themselves is doing the opposite of serving the public and is therefore usurping, right? He's pretending to be the securer of the good for those he rules, but is actually only trying to secure his own, which is a violent thing. It is a power that it requires violence because it's going against the direction of natural rule, because the direction of natural rule is that it is wisdom exercised for the sake of the thing that is being governed. Okay. A lot put out there. I'm glossing a lot of Platonic machinery into this passage just because I see it performing the same work for him here, right? It has the same parallel for him here. We can go back a little bit. I think that there are, just as there are replacements for the notion of arising presence or physis in fissure, there is a similar thing going on here, right? This mastery notion is a replacement for the wisdom of directed by the good in Platonism, right? But it is contrasted with this manipulation of beings for the sake of beings, as what is ascribed to the end of traditional metaphysics a la Nietzsche, or a la technology. Dan?
Is this kind of equivalent with what Husserl and phenomenology said to matters themselves, but transposed to being instead of beings?
Partly, but the thing which is curious here, and I think is original to Heidegger, is the notion that there is something like an appropriate and proper that comes from the things themselves here. And that's, I don't think that's directly in Husserl. Husserl is very much on for the sake of understanding. Husserl has his own hierarchy in which something like science for the sake of truth is his highest value, something like that. But it's still a very traditional value hierarchy kind of orientation, if you get me. He's not expecting a revelation of being to change what he thinks is apt or necessary for the case, except insofar as it's a matter of describing how it actually is. So on matters of truth, yes, Husserl acts this way, but Heidegger is clearly extending this far beyond matters of truth. He's extending to matters of what we would call ethics, or what we would call proper, or what we would call even legitimation. Okay. Okay. So I want to pull back a second and say, levels of being. This is on 215, where he's contrasting the Neoplatonic order of levels, right? What's the issue here? He's explained his whole, the view of the leap. He's, trying to stand on the train of the other beginning, and he's asking what changes there. And the immediate context here is something like Nietzsche's belief that when you abolish the distinction between the true and the apparent world, do you abolish the apparent world too? There's just the world, something like that. So you've collapsed the levels of being, right? There's only the phenomenally existent true. And Heidegger is wrestling with whether or not he can agree with Nietzsche about that and go that way or not. And I think he's coming down on the side of not. But that's the issue here. The issue is when we're in the other beginning, what happens to the traditional hierarchy of beings? By traditional, I mean the Neoplatonic hierarchy, but also the ones you got in German idealism, etc. And what does he end at here? The earth and world distinctions are what come in here. So he has to wrestle with the same problems that those hierarchies solved, but he's trying to do so on the basis of this notion that the what is revealed in the sight and the sight in which is revealed have only this turning relationship with one another, not a towered causal stack on one another. So this is on 216. Then does being indeed possess levels? Properly speaking, no, but neither do beings. And what is the source and sense of manifold shelterings? That cannot be explained and cannot be derived by reckoning of plan of providence, yet it matters just as little as real acceptance of representation. Instead, the issue is the decision and historical necessities out of respect of error of the history of being. So he's putting this on the decisions and on the history, but at the end of this passage and immediately afterwards, he's going to be attacking where Nietzsche took this, so to speak. What do I mean by that? Nietzsche took this in the direction of the underlying is the interior subjective of the thinker, something like that. We would say identity, but what Nietzsche says things all the time like that philosophies are the involuntary confessions of of the thinker, right? And what he means by that is that the thoughts about the high metaphysical ideas are encoded versions of what that kind of life needs, which are encoded versions of the drives in that thinker, something like that. So there's a stack in which the lowest level is the drives, is life, right? So life is primary, and thought and philosophy are epiphenomenal by comparison. They are more refined versions of the same will to power, but underlying it is animal drives life. So while Nietzsche thinks he's abolishing a Platonic hierarchy that has a good soaring above the phenomenal world, instead he's replacing it by one where the bottom of the phenomenal world is now the fundament, right? The low is the source of the high, but it's still that layered thing. And at the end of 152, and then in 153 and 154, Heidegger is rejecting that as an outcome from this. And I think that continues into the things about the fissure we talked about there, because he's recognizing that way lies the rule of beings over being, instead of the other way around. I would add that there is, it replaces calculative machinery with concern for truth. I'm trying to explain to you what's going on in this whole area from that discussion of the levels of being to 159, where he makes the mastery violence distinction, which is right before he turns to the being towards death, right? All that section is about what replaces the orienting aspect of highness in the old metaphysics when you get rid of the old metaphysics, right? If you don't have a good towering over a true and existent, at the top of a little Neoplatonic hierarchy, with their other stratified layers underneath them, but instead you have this just open site for potentially unending, ongoing revelation, if you put it that way, in historical engagement with the truth, right? Then what happens to that, the high orientation of that? And the first question is, does it collapse to a low orientation of that? And the answer is no, right? And the notion of mastery and legitimation by wisdom, or legitimation by truth that's there in traditional philosophy and Platonism, has to be rescued from that. That's what I see that section on violence doing. Along the way, he also deals not just with the Nietzscheans, but with the Kantians and Neo-Kantians, who basically have the question of, can all these levels of being things and all of these things you're talking about in the history aspect of being just be dealt with our modal categories? What do I mean by modal categories? Possible, necessary, actual, where the actual is just an accent on, it's not just that it's a for every, and it's not just that it's a implies, but it's a backwards Z. It's a there exists. It's a existential quantification that didn't have to be that way, but in fact it is, right? It's a logic operator, and that's all that we mean by actual. And that sort of modal calculus of these things is fundamentally in a frame of generality is the highest form of truth, something like that. And that's exactly what Heidegger is concerned to get away from here, with this notion of he wants fundamental ontology to be anchored in what actually happens as what is experientially happening, as what is authentic, the authentic actual once, which does not depend upon generality or necessity to be important, right? Anyway, between the sections on the modalities, I'm thinking of 156 and 158, also about that. Why is this all still in the discussion of the fissure? Because he's talking about the basic constituents that the drama of being with a Y has in it, and that those basic constituents are no longer, life and good, high and low, actual, possible, necessary, actual, right? Those are no longer the prime players on this. I mean, we'll see more about what they actually are in the later section on Dasein in next section and essence of truth. But it's important to notice what he is keeping from traditional metaphysics here. And one of the things he's definitely trying to keep the wonder business. He's definitely trying to keep the mastery business, right? He's trying to keep the orientation on truth, right? Dan.
Is he also trying to take out the essence existence thing?
Yeah. You're right, because the essence existence thing was based upon the essence being something which was true of all the possibles, and the existence added to it was just an actualization backwards Z at the end. And he wants to say instead that what really is what really is in the sense of actual is primary over that, right? And essence is drawn out of it. I will add that in these sections on Kant, it's quite clear that well, even in the whole history of the metaphysics section, at the third section of the whole chapter, how to put this? Heidegger sometimes makes it appear as though the reason that traditional metaphysics understood being as a lowest common denominator is because it arrived at its notion of being by a process of empirical induction. It looked at one being and another being and another being, and it kept going with, through all the beings it could run through, and it looked for a common denominator to factor out of them, right? As though it was an ongoing empirical induction, something like that. That's not how it happens. That's not how the possible necessary actual stuff becomes the way of thinking about these things. It's instead the idea notion to begin with from Plato, and then for these actualization things, it's frankly Aristotle's reading on all those things, and the Kantian tripartite thing is really just reinstantiating the notion of activity, et cetera, that you got in Aristotle, right? So it's Aristotelian causation thinking, if you get me, about how ideas cause things for particulars. That's really behind that, and it's not an induction at all. It's a deduction from a schema and what it logically requires, if I can put it that way. That's where the modalities actually come from, and I think he's reasonably clear about that, and he's certainly clear about that in the sections here about the modalities. It's less clear in the third section itself. Okay, but I definitely wanted to get to the violence thing. We will have to talk at least a little about the being towards death. We managed to talk about it at least once because Christian already brought it up, but there are at least three things going on here. One is he's miffed that everyone misunderstood him about being towards death and being in time, right? And it's too easy to caricature him with ideological things of this is a very pessimistic philosopher, or he keeps talking about death and nothing, he must be a nihilist, superficial stuff, right? But he mentions it because it obviously bothers him that this level of incomprehension is possible, right? What's the chance that the people are going to understand the whole other beginning if they didn't understand, what he was saying there? That's sort of the lament you hear in some of these sections on the being towards death stuff. But that's like just the most superficial thing going on here. The two others are there's a ontology point of the needing business, right? Being needing Dasein in order to appear is different from the thrownness of Dasein that needs being in order to be, right? So the turning is not completely symmetric. That's one way of putting it. But then the other aspect of it is the insistence that this is the reason for the call to authenticity and for the taking the shortest path. The urgency of the concern with philosophical truth here is coming from the finiteness. I also though want to call your attention back to the second one where we talked about the hearth fire metaphor, because you can extend the hearth fire metaphor to the being towards death concern, right? You have to urgently write down what you've discovered and pass it on to someone else to keep the torch race going, if you get me. Anyway, those are the things I see going on in the being towards death sections. I want to give other people a chance to jump in on that if they're seeing more there than I'm explaining. Anyone else want to jump in on any of the being towards death and being sections at the end? No thoughts. Okay. The very last section, essential occurrence and essence. Some of that, again, has a little bit of recapitulation, but fundamentally what he's moving towards here is trying to shift the ground to grounding and Dasein. So we get the paradigmatic statements that, being essentially occurs, beings are. The underlying thing here is to try to move away from grounding being as idea to grounding being in Dasein. And I think that's mostly just transitional, right? It's material that needs to be there to connect to what's going to be happening at the beginning of 5. Hopefully with a bit of bang. Okay. I got into the end of the stuff I want to do expositionally, but I have some reactions to this because and including some things going back to the capsule history of metaphysics recap. Okay. I see plenty of places here where because he is seeing what he has to replace about previous structures, what stays and what goes, Heidegger is Platonizing more than he usually does, if you get me. Much of the kind of metaphysical thinking he's doing here would be perfectly familiar to a Plato, right? Yes, the particular things are going to be, redone slightly, but you could easily see a Parmenidean stranger giving, a lecture on the fissure that was, as a structure like this, trying to explain how this looks to him, and would probably tell it only as a plausible story, right? I'm not saying that makes him Platonist. I'm saying that there's some continuities in philosophy that cross the divide of first beginning, other beginning. Certainly all this stuff about the mastery versus violence stuff could have been written by Plato, right? There's not an element of that which is not Platonic, in my opinion. He would have used slightly different terms, and in this discussion of mastery, he would have mentioned the good more than once, and he would have mentioned the beautiful, and he would have talked about the apt, but the underlying content of the thought or what was being taught there would be the same. It would just be expounded upon even more. So to me, this is not a criticism. This is just recognizing there are elements of the activity of philosophy that make it one thing, not multiple things that are going to be falling apart across whatever new beginning is happening, right? It will remain philosophy, and many of its concerns, truth especially, will remain the same. That's why it's philosophy. So to me, that's a positive, but it's definitely an impression I have in this whole section. There's places in Heidegger where he is very much taking apart what he sees as the errors of the tradition, and there's places where he is saving the bits of it that he thinks desperately need saving. And there's definitely places here where you can see the latter going on, even though this is the leap into the other beginning. Okay. I could probably say more about all that if people prompt me to, but I want to give people a chance to have their own reactions to what we've gone through. Christian, any thoughts or comments on any of these things?
Yeah, sure. So sort of going back a little bit to this discussion of the levels of being.
Yes.
I agree with you, Jason, that I think he's actually quite sympathetic to something like a Platonic, some elements of the Platonic philosophy in these pages. Yeah, of course, there's always this underlying thing. I think I think he wants to sort of, the notion of essence is something that he wants to transform as well. But I really agree with what you were saying, that he's not just doing the Nietzschean thing of trying to knock down the what Nietzsche saw as the Platonic hierarchy of the good, sort of grounding and orienting the rest of the hierarchy, and then he sort of accuses Nietzsche of just, you know, replacing that with life, the way you put it, that the top sort of becomes the bottom, but that's just the new grounding of the hierarchy, that, you know, life and drive and impulses are what's fundamental. And I think there's also elements of that elements of it that Heidegger is sympathetic to, but he's you know, even in Being and Time, he's always trying to compare his view to people who sort of talk about the metaphysics of life, and he's sort of carefully trying to distinguish his own view from that. And
Yes,
but I
the
did
life
read that as
theorist.
sort of, yeah, exactly. But I did read that as, even though there's that section where he says, so are there levels of being, properly speaking? No. Nonetheless, I almost think that he is more sympathetic to something more like a Platonic uh, view on that you can sort of, there's a way of looking at it where you can understand there to be sort of different levels of being, or you can at least interpret it that way from a certain point of view. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
but I'm just, go ahead.
he's still making the distinctions here between, you know, philosophy as an activity, all of Dasein or mankind, the animal and plant is living, the, you know, the stones is extant, the world and earth, right? And all of these things, those, the underlying distinctions dividing those are levels of being.
Yeah.
Right. The fact that a, you know, a conscious intelligent soul is different from what a cricket has, and the fact that even what a cricket has is different from what the trees have, and the fact that what the trees has is a life that is not there in stones, all of those are recognizing some you know, levels of being essential distinction that, yes, we also use to divide up our sciences to study them, whatever, but there's something more than that going on there. There's a notion that there is a progression or hierarchy toward thought likeness, right, and life, that is the presence of some specific extras, and those specific extras are things which are not mere material objects, but are part of the organizing categories of the world, right? And the place that the actual Platonic hierarchy of being comes from is making those distinctions. It doesn't come from, you know, imagining 6 further towers of such distinctions, you know, beyond experience, right? They arise within experience as those sorts of things. And if you in Nietzsche, the attempt is crude, but the attempt is to reduce the higher things to the lower in a outright reductionist way, that is designed to collapse that hierarchy and therefore to explain consciousness as at bottom a function and phenomena of life. And as Nietzsche famously puts it one place, you know, don't think that the living is the opposite of the dead. The living is only a kind of thing that is dead, in a very rare kind, right? So in Nietzsche, the desire to reduce, the positivist side of Nietzsche that has this desire to reduce is there and is meant to be pushed to the end. And Heidegger is not sympathetic to any of that. None of that is going to leave any place for a place or site in which being appears, and a exalted destiny for man as the shepherd or steward of truth. Right? There's none of that in a collapsed hierarchy like that. And so he is not willing to go along with the collapsing of the hierarchy in terms of what its implications are. So the way in which he's going to understand Dasein is not to say that there's a special soul thing, which is different from, you know, the dead thing and so on, right? And you can critique traditional metaphysics for its tendency to make objects of all of those levels of distinctions and turn them into special kinds of beings, special kinds of, you know, entities, and then, you know, then people trying to find the magic formula to create or whatever. But still the underlying thrust here is Heidegger is sympathetic to what that hierarchy preserves, and he's not doing that because he needs that he's not doing that because value thinking of the kind that Nietzsche starts from and pretends that Platonism is essential to him. It's not, right?
Right.
But even that reduction of Plato to a value hierarchy as opposed to a hierarchy of actual being was a reduction on Nietzsche's part. He was simplifying an opponent in order to readily attack him, right? In terms of how Nietzsche treats Plato. But anyway, I think that all those things are engaged here, and what I see is in that discussion, Heidegger is not willing to go back to anything like dogmatic Platonism for sure, but it's not because he's going to agree with the Nietzschean attack that is the proximate overthrower of it, something like that. No. So there's definite rehabilitations of the things that Nietzsche has been attacking here. There have to be, because he's not going to end up in the Nietzschean place. So there's always going to be implicit criticisms of how he got there and rejections of thoughts along the way. To me, the most striking of those is the mastery section. Nietzsche would never write that section. Nietzsche would never distinguish between mastery and violence and say that violence is never part of mastery.
Yeah.
The person
In
who wrote
fact, he probably would equate them.
the person who wrote the genealogy of morals would never write that, right? But any Socratic would, right? Dan.
Yeah, we are reading all these books and we are going back and forth, and it seems like at the time of Plato, things were still fluid and for grabs, and then Plato came up with this like truth and all kind of things and hierarchies and so on, and then things start to crystallize there, and then we discussed when the true Aletheia collapsed, was it with Aristotle or is it Plato, or and it seems like Heidegger thinks that it started with Plato, and Nietzsche sensed something that is there and tried to attack it, but he was not deep enough to go and take it as radical as Heidegger is doing here. And pretty much he's saying we need to make things again fluid, and all this fissure and so on and trembling, it's rearranging them in the proper way. As you said, this is kind of the turning and new structures, a new beginning, a new event, and that's when being with why is coming in.
He is definitely trying to make them fluid again. He's trying to make them questionable again, and he's trying to trying to show that it is possible to re-engage with them that way on the basis of how they fit into how we actually experience them, or something like that, as opposed to in the traditional theoretical hierarchies. But but on this issue of where the capsule recap of Western metaphysics that happens in 117, right, runs through all this, and the more I reread these capital histories, the clearer it is to me that the actual turning point is not Plato, but it's Aristotle. And I even went through this section and I found broke out into 7 different things. There's like at least 7 different positions being sketched here, and you can see the transitions between them. And even some of the later positions in it, to the extent that they were not fully on a straight line from Aristotelianism, but retained separate direct links from Platonism, aren't all the way down the level of the next step he's talking about. What do I mean by that? So being as the most common, emptiest, and best known, right? That is a very late version of this. That's like Christian Wolff level, right? But the transition away from thinking idea as the nature of the being of the beings at a minimum, right? To thinking of that as a something whose actuality is in a mind as a concept that can be formulated verbally into something which is accurately or not accurately matching something in an external reality, right? That set of transitions is very much Aristotle, and almost everything that he talked about after in that chain is based upon that, right? It's not there before that, and when you have later thinkers that are only half in that camp, that is, they're, I'm thinking of the Avicennas or the Duns Scotuses of the world, who are not like, they're influenced by Aristotelianism, but they're not going to go all in on it because they think Plato is right on some of the points where he's in contention with Plato. With Aristotle. They're not all the way on the line across any of the given lines that Heidegger lays out here, right? He talks about the being as first cause, and first in the direction of time, thought in the commonsensical manner, right? That's exactly what you'll get in Aquinas, and Duns Scotus will object to and will want to replace with, no, when I say first, I actually mean in the direction of a hierarchy of being, not in a temporal relationship, right? And so why? Because he wants to leave open the possibility of an Aristotelian rather than of a Platonic rather than Aristotelian metaphysics, something like that. So he'll have a big debate with Aquinas where he wants to keep that, but that means that this point about in the steps of decline, of supposed decline that Heidegger is sketching out, one of them will be when you think of first cause as just being in a temporal direction, thought of in a naive way, right? Well, where is that? That answer is that's coming from the Aristotelians of the world, not from the Platonists of the world. Anyway, I can track all those issues through there. It's never going to mean that Heidegger is on the side of the Platonists in this, but many of the things, truth is correctness, another one along the same way. You can read those things and asks for each of the criticisms he has of a piece of traditional metaphysics. Where does it start applying in the history? And some of them won't apply until Nietzsche, and some won't apply until Descartes, and some will, at various stages they'll start applying. But the number that apply all the way back to the beginning gets smaller and smaller, right? Okay. And you can have your own diagnoses of how or why that happens. The other thing I'll say, though, is that in his own, if we put it this way, his fundamental ontology sympathies, Heidegger wants to be even more actualist, if I can put it this way, than Aristotle, right? Aristotle doesn't want to have abstract beings. He wants to have, concrete material particulars, but material, that's at least a class, right? Heidegger wants a history that happens once, right? So he's going more actual still. It's a move from the abstract towards the actual that is not willing to stop even where Aristotle stopped, right? On that continuum. So in that sense, his sympathies are in that direction and very much against the Platonic direction. Okay. Yeah. I didn't manage to cover some of the parallels with Hegel I saw in this section. I do see some of them. There's both the turning business and the circle in Hegel. There's also the thinking about the nothing and being a nothing that is quite prominent in Hegel, and he even mentions it here a couple times without being he's not down on it when he's mentioning it here. He's just saying that he's calling it unusual that people even think about it that way. That stuff in Hegel on the nothing actually also goes back to the Neoplatonists. People mostly don't know that, but it's true. What's the point here? The point here is that there are elements of how he's thinking about these core metaphysics questions from the traditional point of view of what counts as metaphysics, core ontology questions that are, if not following or modeled on, still quite parallel to considerations that you get in Hegel, the people who influenced Hegel, Plato, Socratics, and you can see that throughout some of the sections. That said, it's all of the full structure of all these things put together of, the new meaning of being, the grounding in Dasein as the there in between. All of this is very much his own, right? And we're now firmly into the territory of his own, and the parts which are going to be just sort of commentaries in the history of philosophy is going to drop away more and more. Joe, I want to give you a chance, if you are still awake, to ask me any questions about parts which were or weren't comprehensible. And has any of this made any of this more comprehensible for you?
I found it very, very interesting. And actually, when I reached the points of the discussion that you would have been citing during this presentation, I'm going to be very eager to go back and watch this video, which is why I like you to record them, because it reinforces, I listen, I read, I'm confused, I go back and listen again, less confusion. It's a progress. So thank you.
Great. We'll miss the intros, but I think we got the didactic part at least. All right. So I just want to reiterate that for next time, we're looking at June 9th and just 5A and 5B. Those are the sections on the Dasein sections of the chapter 5, the grounding. So that's sections 168 to 203 inclusive for June 9th, same time. Dan, question?
Yeah, I will not be able to make it on from June 8 to June 16. I will be traveling to Europe, and probably also relevant here, I will be in Freiburg for 2 days there, 15, 16, see some tracks, some Heidegger there.
Okay, cool. I had a niece who was out that way for a math thing just recently, but anyway, Black Forest and people's itineraries. Cool. Okay, so we'll definitely miss you. I mean, I wish we could move it, but I don't have a lot more availability in June, so I can't really pick a different weekend that month. But okay. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks for all the questions. Any final comments from anyone? All right, in that case, I will end the recording and see you guys all next time.